talk is from Floris.
Thank you for that kind introduction. So no, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm joking. And thank you for giving me the honor to present the last talk. I hope I'll keep you awake. I've tried to make some parts of it interactive, just to get you out of your pre-lunch dip. So the question that I'm going to try to answer a little bit today is how all our prior beliefs and expectations, of which we may have seen an example in Kat Sakai's talk as well, how they change our perception. And this is just an example of some Mooney stimuli where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to see what they are. Does anybody have any idea what's on these? No guesses? So if I give you a little bit of prior experience by having this fish swim across the screen, now it may be much more obvious what we're looking at the left hand of the screen at any rate. So even though this stimulus hasn't changed, just the fact that I gave you that experience, now all of a sudden, alters your interpretation of this noisy input here. So I'm interested in how that is possible, so how our brain implements that influence of knowledge on our perception. And here I think is another interesting example where priors from spatial context really change not even so much how quickly we can see something or our ability to see something, but really the interpretation of an element in the scene. So if we compare these two street scenes, I think most observers don't have any problem identifying this element here as a car that is parked by the side of the road, whereas here there would be a pedestrian crossing the street. However, in isolation, if I would take away the surround from these elements, this is really the same blob, which is just turned around or rotated 90 degrees. To me, this is a very powerful demonstration of how, in this case, the predictions that we can make about this blob from how it is placed in its surround powerfully changes the interpretation of that object. Okay, so how does that work in the brain? So let me just give it first a very schematic way of how it might not work, how I think it cannot work, which is this sort of the standard bottom-up interpretation of perception, where you would have, for example, a fish of which the light reflects on your eye. Well, then it moves throughout the brain to ever more cortically specialized areas, and at the end of that journey, your brain has realized that it's looking at a fish. That's, in a sense, to some extent maybe a straw man, but that is, I think, still quite dominating view of how perceptual decisions are made in the brain. And I think the example that I gave you on the title slide already shows how this cannot be the whole story. Because now we are all looking at a fish, even though when I started my talk we were not. We were just looking at some meaningless blobs. So in that sense, the prior experience that we have or the cues that we have gotten powerfully change our perception. Now, an idea that has gained traction also in the last decade is this more top-down view of perception, or more active hypothesis testing view of perception, where we may start with a certain hypothesis that may feed back all the way down to the earliest cortical stages, and which is then complemented by bottom-up information, and leading us to the realization that we're looking at a fish. Okay, so this is sometimes also referred to as hierarchical probabilistic inference, and the idea being that higher order areas in, for example, the ventral visual stream provide constraints to the processing of earlier areas, just like the outside world has this hierarchical structure that provides constraints to the interpretation of individual objects. So in isolation, this is meaningless blob, but in the context of this object, it becomes quite easy to recognize it as a rear light of a car. And at the same level, the car might be more easily interpreted in the context of a street scene. Okay, so as I've been saying, this idea that there is this recurrent message passing between regions, where higher order regions provide predictions for the sensory processing of lower order areas, has gained a lot of traction, for example, by Carl Freston's free energy notion. And it may constitute this fundamental principle for understanding the operation of the brain. However, I think there's a lot of gaps in terms of how this is really implemented. So that's, in a nutshell, my research goal. I'm trying to elucidate how that actually works, so how predictions about the world change the neural computations that give rise to perception. Now, I'm going to, I think that fully answering that question really requires looking at it at least 3 levels of analysis. And I'm going to try to cover each of these 3 very shortly in my talk today. So I think, first of all, I think it's important to see how expectations change this sensory response, so how input is processed by, for example, early cortical areas like V1. And the first part of my talk will focus on that. And I'll give you some pilot data even, where we're going to look really at the communication within a cortical column. So whether expectation and input signals may be represented in different layers and how they are combined. So that's really at the nerdy low level, V1 level. So if you are, I will then also shift to the more network level, so we're a little bit more related to what Kat Sakai was talking about, where I will have some faith in Carl Friston's method of looking at connectivity. So I hope Kat will bear with me there. And then I think the final level that is also extremely important is, of course, the product of all these neural computations, namely perceptual experience. And that will be the third thing that I'll try to talk about today. So how do expectations actually change our perceptual experience? How do they change things like how bright we perceive a stimulus to be? And there we also have some unpublished data that I was quite surprised about, and that I think people, especially who take the view of comparator models of perception, might be surprised about. All right, but let's start with so this is the outline of my talk, so let's start with the first part, so the sensory response. So how do priors modulate sensory activity? Here there has been some old answers from the group of Scott Murray, predating talks on free energy, where but in a very similar spirit as later predictive coding stories, where they suggest that when you have are looking at an object, or what objects do is inhibit activity at earlier levels. So the title of this paper is "Shape Perception Reduces Activity in Human Primary Visual Cortex." And the idea is that when you have a hypothesis, or when you can explain the input at the level of an object, such as here, when these line elements form a coherent object, you have explained the input at that level, and that has an inhibitory influence on the processing at the level of V1. So the data to support that is given here, where you see an increase in object selective activity going from just randomly oriented lines to shapes, whereas you see the converse pattern in the primary visual cortex. However, this picture is somewhat muddied by other people, like Zoe Kurtzi, and also some electrophysiological work that suggests exactly the opposite pattern of results. So people like her have shown that shape perception may actually increase activity at V1. And admittedly, the stimuli are different, but so what they are looking at here, for example, is these fields of Gabor patches where the Gabors are either oriented such that they form a shape, so as here you have this circular orientation, or they are misaligned so that they don't form any shape. And whereas there is a convergence at the level of LOC, so here as well you see larger activity for shapes than for non-shapes, here also at the level of early visual cortical areas an increase is found. Now, what to make of that? I must say I was quite puzzled by this when I was reading on the literature. And then my postdoc suggested that we might actually have not so much suppression or an enhancement per se in V1, but that one could have both, depending on whether the feature that is either present or absent is expected or unexpected. So that what we're seeing at the level of V1 is more of a prediction error response. And for example, if we look at these stimuli, so indeed the object hypothesis would predict the orientation of all the elements that are here. So at that level you might expect an inhibition response at the level of V1. But at the same time, you could imagine that that shape hypothesis leads to a surprising absence of input at all the intersection levels. So in that sense, I'm not so sure I mean, it turns out that if you just measure the whole net activity in V1, that there is an increase in this case. But you might actually, if you would be able to look at this at a little more fine-grained level, you might see both a suppression and an enhancement. So that's what we tried to look at in the context of slightly different stimulus that also that we thought were a little bit more suitable, which is this stimulus. So we all know the Kanitsa stimuli. Yeah, we have this triangle here that is just formed by the orientation of these Pac-Man surrounding stimuli. Some people even really see this as brighter as the surrounding. I don't know if some of you may have that impression. Of course, that is not physically present. And what we thought is that, well, when we have a stimulus like this, and we would compare it to a control stimulus where we would just rotate the Pac-Man, what we have here is an object that predicts the orientation of all these Pac-Man. So we sort of reduce the complexity of this scene by having this triangle superimposed on circles. So we thought that what we were expecting here is an inhibition of the input that is expected on the basis of that shape or on the basis of that object. But at the same time, you may have an enhancement at the shape location where there is no input, but there might be an expectation of input based on that shape hypothesis. So that's what we wanted to look at by contrasting the neural activity to stimuli like that with stimuli like that. And indeed, when we would just look at V1 activity, this is one participant, simply not sorting for a retinotopic location, you see that it looks a bit messy. I wouldn't know what to make of it. There's some red, there's some blue. In other words, there's a bit of both, and it doesn't look like this clean pattern that the previous studies have been showing, where you just have a suppression or an enhancement. So now what we did is we made use of a trick that was based on some work by Brian Wendell's group, where they used population receptive field mapping. And what that basically does is for each voxel, it estimates both the receptive field location that it's most sensitive to, as well as how large the receptive field is in these different areas. So we used that technique and tweaked it a bit such that we could reconstruct neural activity in stimulus space. So that's what you're looking at here. So here you can see the bold activity difference for this same participant. So this is the same data, looking at the difference of activity between this stimulus, but then transferred back into stimulus space. And yeah, this already starts looking a lot nicer, I think, where we have this strong enhancement of activity at the location of the triangle, flanked by suppression of activity at the location of these inducers. So this is for one subject. Here I'm showing you the group result. And yeah, I found this data quite compelling. So you can really see that for example, the modulatory pattern follows the shape direction. So if we have a leftward pointing triangle, you have suppression of these three. Whereas if you have a rightward pointing arrow, the suppression basically follows the triangle very well. And you can also see a bit of a surprise response for the stimulus that does not adhere to the shape. And I think it's also interesting that this is independent of what subjects are doing. So it doesn't matter whether subjects were doing a task at fixation and completely ignoring these stimuli, or whether they were spatially attending to these stimuli to look for some deviance. Okay, so now I also promised you a little bit of cortical column data, and I think this is actually very important for understanding how expectations are combined with bottom-up input at the level of V1. So the question is then, can we zoom in further on the cortical column? As you may know, a cortical column is about 2.5 millimeters. So the typical resolution of fMRI, you would not be able to discern information processing in different cortical layers. But for this, theoretically, the idea is that top-down signals, for example, conveying expectations, come in at particular layers, particularly in the deep layers, perhaps also the superficial layers, but avoiding this layer here, and are then combined with information, or these expectations are then combined with input signals that come in layer 4, which they may then generate error signals that propagate up to the hierarchy. This is the beautiful theoretical model that people like Carl Friston have been proposing, but data on this is of course very difficult to get, and we were hoping to get at that level. And we thought that particularly this stimulus would be very useful in looking at that, because here we have a situation where there is no bottom-up input whatsoever. It's a gray screen, yet there is a strong activity difference for regions that respond to that gray screen, depending on whether there is a top-down interpretation here or not. And so this is preliminary data. This is unpublished, but it does indeed look like there is an agranular bias for these top-down signals. So here I'm plotting you the activity difference between, or the activity in these voxels, but then sorted for their cortical or their laminar depth from the superficial to the granular to the deep layers. And it indeed looks like well, of course, the whole cortical column is more activated for these stimuli than for these, but there's also a bias towards a larger activity in the deep layers, which are putatively carrying these expectation signals. So I think that's, yeah, this is just the start of that analysis. The next thing that we would be interested in looking at is to do exactly this, but then for the suppression signals of these inputs. And there we would maybe expect a shift of this pattern where layer 4 would be particularly suppressed by having a top-down expectation. So that's work in progress. Okay, so that's just looking at a single cortical node and how prior expectations changes processing in that node. Of course, there are many brain regions that respond to unexpected situations and unexpected input, and Marcus has talked about that as well. And here, this is really sort of more where I want to go than where I can already authoritatively tell you a lot about. So I think an important question for me still is, what are the sources of expectation? What regions are actually signaling first, yeah, that something is unexpected, and how are these expectations communicated throughout the brain? And yeah, I'm just going to show you one experiment that is already a little bit older, that we have done sort of a first stab at this problem, where we're trying to get at network communication between sensory and non-sensory regions that change as a function of expectation. This is work done by Dobi Ranev, a former grad student from Hakwan Lau's lab, who were camping out in my lab for a while, and then we were doing this study. He's now at Georgia. And what he did is he basically had people make judgment on random dot motion stimuli, as many people have been doing. And on some trials, he presented cues, or in some blocks, people could form expectation about the upcoming motion direction that was then either valid or invalid, but that was, of course, most of the time valid. So what he compared is, at a brain-wide level, stimuli that were either of which subjects had an expectation versus where they did not have an expectation, and also then stimuli that were expected versus unexpected. And maybe important to note is that he did not use a fixed response mapping, so that these expectations were really perceptual rather than expectations also about what decision to make in terms of the motor output. Now, very quickly, these are the results from just which brain regions are showing a main effect of expectation. So the brain regions in yellow here show more activation when you are in a situation where you have a prior expectation compared to when you don't. And it's a surprisingly constrained set of regions, really. So it's like we only found this in the parietal and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And when we look at the conjunction of both having a presence and the validity of expectation, so regions that are affected by having an expectation, and also whether that expectation is matched by the input. There was only the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that showed that pattern. So, and the pattern is as depicted here. So there is the largest activity when you had an expectation that was then actually falsified by the data. So we're looking here at only the correct trials. And lower activity when you had a valid expectation. Now, we thought maybe more interesting than just looking at the activity was to look at how sensory regions interact with this region. So we thought this region in general, before I go there, makes sense given some earlier work from, for example, Hauke Hekeres' lab and others as well that implicate this region in integrating evidence over time for perceptual decision making. So we see our region is very similar in anatomical location to, for example, the region found in this 2004 Nature paper by Hauke. So when as I said, this is where I have to trust Carl on his method. So we used a couple of methods, both PPI analysis and DCM analysis, to look at the connectivity between the sensory regions involved in this task, in this case MT, that were of course responding more to moving than to static dots. We see that there is a steeper regression slope between this area and the DLPFC when people have an expectation about upcoming motion compared to when they don't. So the predictive cues show stronger slope here than the non-predictive cues. And when Dobie was doing his DCM modeling, he also tried out different models of how expectation may change the connectivity pattern between MT and the DLPFC. And he found most evidence and so significantly better fits for a recurrent modulation, so where expectation changed both the feed-forward and the feedback communication between sensory and non-sensory areas. Okay, good. So that's as far as we got with this network perspective. But I think a lot of work should be done here still. And yeah, that's. Hopefully we will do that in the future. So then let me turn to the final part, which is how does that actually translate into experience? So that's so how is subjective experience altered by our prior expectations? And I think one of the maybe most pervasive hypotheses here, which we had as well, is that expected stimuli would be perceived as less intense. And there is quite a lot of evidence for this notion, for example, also from people like Patrick Haggard, and Sarah Blakemore has already had some elegant study from the motor domain, where when you have the same somatosensory sensation that is either triggered by yourself or by an external force, the self-generated sensations are perceived as much less intense. And there's many examples of that. There is the alternative hypothesis that comes more from the attention literature that would actually give you exactly the opposite prediction. So people like Marisa Carrasco have shown that attended stimuli, at least, are perceived as more intense. For example, the perceived contrast could shift from a stimulus like this to a stimulus like that simply by attending that stimulus. So to the extent that expectation may help you to attend better, you might have an opposite hypothesis here. So we were somewhat biased towards this hypothesis, but we were curious to see which one of the two it was. And this is the experiment that we did to try to find out. So what we have here is on each trial, subjects were given 2 gratings, and they had to, in the first case, they had to report the orientation of the grating with the highest contrast. So this is a bit of a double task. Marisa Carrasco has used this a lot as well to make, for several reasons, which I maybe won't go into now. But basically what you have here is you're looking at these 2 gratings and you might determine, okay, this one has the higher contrast, and then you have to say, okay, I have the orientation of that grating is counterclockwise. And the expectation of these gratings, of the orientation, was manipulated by these placeholders. So in each trial, these placeholders could either be blue, such as in this trial, which would basically have a flat prior, so which would tell you it's equally likely that the stimulus is counterclockwise or clockwise, or it would be green or purple. And if it would be green, you would have most chance of the gratings to be oriented like this, and purple the other way around. So, so the color of these placeholders would give you an expectation of the orientation of the stimuli, and then you are going to do a task on the orientation of the highest contrast. Okay, so first of all, if we just look at behavior, so of course we then manipulate the contrast of one of these gradings compared to the other. And we call that the test grading. So of course, if the test grading has higher contrast, it will be reported as higher contrast. We can get those, we get basically both measurements at the same time. And yeah, obviously, people report the test to be of higher contrast when it has a higher contrast. So on top of that, the orientation task accuracy was very high. So people are doing very well on this task. So now let's have a look at when the test stimulus was either expected, when there was a neutral expectation, or was unexpected. And what you can see here, so we were plotting this in terms of point of subjective equality, which means how much contrast does the test stimulus have to have in order to appear similar. So in order for people to be 50-50 at saying whether the test or the other one was of higher contrast. And what you can see is that for when the stimulus is expected, it has to be of lower contrast for it to appear subjectively equivalent to the other one. So in other words, expected stimuli seem to be associated with a higher perceived contrast than unexpected stimuli. Neutral stimuli were exactly in between of those. In terms of orientation task accuracy, these expectation cues also helped. You can see that people were people were generally doing quite well, but they're doing much better when the orientation was expected compared to when it was neutral or unexpected. So this favors more of an attention account of expectation rather than a suppression account as the comparator model would have it. And we then reasoned, okay, if that's the case, if this really has to do, or if these expectations are really like gated through attentional mechanisms here, then perhaps all of this would go away if the expectations are no longer relevant, if they don't really serve any purpose anymore. And to get at that, we slightly modified the task, only very slightly. We basically asked subjects no longer to report the orientation of the grading with the highest contrast, but simply to report which side had the highest contrast. So which grading had the highest contrast. So now we still have these expectations, or at least we still induce them in our subjects, but they have no relevance for the task anymore. It doesn't matter whether what orientation the stimuli have. So if indeed these expectation cues helped to attend better, and that's what's driving our effect on subjective experience, we should no longer see effect on a subjective experience when these expectations are no longer relevant, when they are not attended. And that is indeed exactly what we get. So now we do not see any shift in the point of subjective equality anymore for expected, neutral, or unexpected stimuli. So they're all, they're statistically no different. And of course also the reaction times are now no longer affected. They're also slightly faster because it's a simpler task. You don't have to report the orientation anymore. You just have to go with one of them. And but importantly there is no difference as a form of expectation. So to wrap up that last part, so somewhat surprisingly to us, maybe you can help me interpret this result, but we were quite surprised that actually valid expectations lead to higher perceived contrast. And that effect is absent when the expected feature is irrelevant to the subject's task. And what it suggested to us was that what happens here is that expectation modulations of perceived intensity are really gated through attention. So that expectations here help you to better attend, and that then only when it's relevant leads to a change in intensity. Okay, so let me then wrap up my talk. So I hope to have shown you that prior expectations change sensory processing in neurons all the way down to the level of the primary visual cortex, and but definitely not exclusively to the primary visual cortex. So there's many regions that are modified by prior expectations, and well, so far we think that this modulation may be mediated ultimately by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but I think a lot more work has to be done there. I think there's also interesting work from Nick Turk-Brown on the hippocampus, suggesting that whenever there is a violation of whatever world state you think you should be having, that creates a new memory that then subsequently changes your sensory processing. So we are planning some new experiments on that. And in terms of the product of it, yeah, we think that although expected stimuli are associated with an attenuated response, I haven't shown you much of that, but we have shown in several studies that whenever you have an expected stimulus, that leads to an attenuation of a sensory response. So in spite of that attenuation, perceptual experience is actually typically enhanced by expectation. And one speculation that we haven't tested is that could be due to sharpening of a representation. So that even though you have an overall attenuation of your sensory response, what you really are having is a sharpened representation, which is therefore also perceptually more intense. But that's work in progress. Okay, and with that I would like to thank you for your attention, and the people, particularly Peter Kok, Anna Todorovic, and Simon van Gaal in my lab, who have been doing the actual work presented. Thank you very much.